Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started as people trickle in. My name is Mary Hope Rollins. Welcome to Georgetown University Right to Life's annual Lives Worthy of Respect event. We're thrilled to have with us today Father Myles Sheehan, Director of the Pellegrino Center for Clinical Bioethics, to moderate a discussion on racial justice as a pro-life issue. Tonight's panel features Gloria Purvis of the Gloria Purvis podcast, Walter B. Hoye of Issues for Life, and Herb Geraghty of Rehumanize International. Before I dive into introductions, I'm going to make a few brief announcements about free speech and tonight's format. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the maximum exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that audience members may not share the same views as the speaker, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event will respect the right of the speakers to share their perspectives and ideas and not cause a disruption to the event's activities. Today's forum will be recorded for any viewers who are unable to attend or have to leave early and posted on the Georgetown University Right to Life YouTube page. We'll begin with a brief period of moderated discussion by Father Sheehan and our other panelists before transitioning to audience questions. So don't forget to submit any questions through the Q&A function throughout the event. With that, I'm just going to do an introduction of our panelists, and then we will begin. Gloria Purvis is a graduate of Cornell University, and she worked for nearly 2 decades in the mortgage industry before becoming a risk management director at a major financial services company. She served on the National Black Catholic Congress Leadership Commission on Social Justice and as an advisory board member on the Maryland Catholic Conference's Respect for Life Department, as well as the Archdiocese of Washington's Pastoral Council. She also taught natural family planning and helped prepare engaged couples for marriage as a member of a pre-Cana team in the Archdiocese of Washington. She has appeared in various media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, PBS NewsHour, Catholic Answers Live, and EWTN News Nightly, and hosted Morning Glory, an international radio show. She is our Sunday Visitors Catholic of the Year for 2020. She's a full stay-at-home mother and consultant for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee on Religious Liberty and on the board of advisors for our Sunday Visitors Real and True Catechism Project. She's the creator and host of the EWTN TV series Authentically Free at Last that deals with the modern challenges to the expression and understanding of authentic human freedom. She is currently the creator, host, and executive producer of the Gloria Purvis podcast. The podcast discusses current news and complex issues at the intersection of church and society and creates space for those voices and perspectives not often given a platform. She is dedicated to promoting the sanctity of human life, marriage, and the dignity of the human person. You can follow her on Twitter at Gloria Purvis and Instagram, I am Gloria Purvis, and subscribe to her podcast. As a national Black pro-life leader, Reverend Walter Hoye speaks for those who have no voice, understands that abortion takes the life of a child, an innocent human being, views the woman and child as one, and demands men embrace their biblical roles as protector and provider. Walter made headlines in 2009 when he was arrested for passing out pro-life information at an abortion facility in Oakland, California. Reverend Hoye's peaceful action earned him a 30-day sentence in Alameda County's Santa Rita jail. His conviction has since been overturned. Walter travels around the country and the world full-time to convey a unique pro-life message only he can share. He's a widely requested speaker who addresses the pro-life movement with special emphasis on the impact of abortion in the Black America, personhood, and the role of men meeting the physical and spiritual needs of women. Walter strongly believes, open quote, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture the prophetic seal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Strength to Love, 1963. And lastly, Herb Geraghty is the Executive Director of Rehumanize International, a secular, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to bringing an end to all forms of aggressive violence against human beings through education, discourse, and action. Herb's unique position as a politically independent pro-life atheist has broken down barriers to reach demographics often untapped by the mainstream pro-life movement. Similarly, Herb's common ground on the abortion issue with many folks on the political right has enabled productive outreach on the issues of war, torture, and the death penalty. Herb has a passion for building bridges and finding common ground with people across the political spectrum to call everyone to a greater consistency in the fight for human rights. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Father Sheehan to kick off our conversation. As a reminder, submit your questions throughout the dialogue using the Q&A function. And on behalf of Georgetown Right to Life, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Mary Hope. It's wonderful to be with our guests this evening, and I really appreciate your taking the time to be with us. The group planning this came up with a series of questions, and I'm going to be asking all of you some of these questions. But Herb, can I start with you? What I'd like to ask is, how did you become involved in this pro-life movement? Since it's a little bit of a different direction than perhaps some of us. And can you talk a little bit about your current work in the movement?
Absolutely. So I always want to stress the importance of a pro-life story. I know so many people come into the movement or become pro-life because of, a profound event that happens in their life. I don't have that at all, though. I have a very boring story where, as I was becoming politically aware, I'm in sophomore in high school, maybe I'm taking a government class, I'm in AP Gov, and so I have to have opinions about social issues. I sort of belong to a feminist liberal milieu, so I learn about abortion and I assume I'm pro-choice. And so I spend, a couple years of being somewhat politically aware as, nominally pro-choice, but not super passionate about it. And it wasn't until I was on social media, particularly Tumblr, where I was, on liberal social justice Tumblr. And I came across a particular blog. It was actually, her name was on Tumblr was LGBT Pro-Life. And I remember she looked really cool. She was a transgender woman. She had like good opinions on feminism and things that I agreed with. And I remember just being so bugged that she was anti-abortion and being like, well, why would you, you're so cool. Why are you anti-abortion? What's wrong with you? And so that sort of sparked this curiosity in me, not even why someone would be pro-life, but a curiosity of wanting to defend my default pro-choice position. And so, I'm in high school and I'm Googling things like Planned Parenthood and NARAL and basically trying to get my talking points together. And unfortunately, for my social life at the time, I was on Planned Parenthood's own website and I was like, ugh, the way they're talking about abortion kind of sounds like it's killing a baby and we're just talking around that fact. And so that basically was it. I slowly was like going towards more neutral sources, government stuff, medical textbooks. And it was then, at that time, I wasn't religious. I was raised vaguely, I was baptized Catholic, but I wasn't practicing, once I was age 5, didn't really go to church. And so I was an atheist. And so it was really the science of, basic embryology, the fact that nearly every embryologist agrees that what is created at the moment of sperm egg fusion during the process of fertilization or conception is that genetically distinct whole living human organism, like basically the pro-life apologetic basic course. I heard that and I unfortunately did the research and learned it was true. And then I was like, oh no, now I have to be pro-life. And so from then on, I went from being kind of nominally pro-choice into being nominally pro-life. And I was like, okay, well, abortion's wrong, but I'm not really going to do anything about it. And at the time when I grew up in Philadelphia, and during when I was in high school and kind of coming into this pro-life position was when Kermit Gosnell was arrested. And if you're not familiar with Gosnell's story, horrific butcher. He was an abortionist in Philadelphia. We can talk about him later because his story has a lot of intersections with racism, situations where white women were given totally different standards of care of Black women and immigrant women. And he not only was endangering the lives of children, but he also ended up killing women through his late term abortions. And it was really just a horrific situation that was very close to me. You know, if that was probably the nearest abortion clinic to me growing up. And I didn't know it was there. You know, I thought of abortion as this thing that was bad, but I didn't, you know, it didn't affect my life. It wasn't something that happened a lot. It was a rare circumstance. And so I didn't think of myself as pro-life in my identity as something that was very important to me until then. And then I went off to college and I ended up getting involved in my Students for Life of America chapter. And since then I have just been, you know, just a raging anti-abortion extremist. And that is what I do now. But at the same time, I got into this movement. I became pro-life when I already had these kind of left-leaning, social justice-oriented positions on things like, you know, economic justice, on racism, on the death penalty, on war. And so I continued to believe all those things. You know, I didn't go from, you know, a social justice oriented feminist to pro-life and then was like, oh, now I got to be Republican. I kept a lot of those positions, and I was involved in the College Republicans because pro-life became my #1 issue. But during that time, I even was sort of, you know, I felt torn. I was like, I believe all of these things, but they seem in our culture and in the political paradigm to sort of be at odds with each other. You can't be both, you know, anti-racist and pro-life. The media doesn't present that as an option. And so it wasn't until I found the consistent life ethic and the organization I work for now, Rehumanize International, that I found a community of people that I felt like I could be my entire self with. I didn't have to sort of go into a space and know that if I bring up being anti-abortion, it's going to be really controversial, or go into a space and bring up, you know, being anti-death penalty and anti-war, that some people are going to get mad at me. So I found the consistent life ethic movement, and that is where I work now. As Mary said in my intro, I work to build bridges among these different movements. For all types of people, wherever they are on the political spectrum, calling everyone to start with the basic idea that human beings deserve to live free from violence. And in practice, that means working on a whole host of issues, from abortion to the death penalty and euthanasia and a lot of things. So that's what I do now. That's the kind of long of it, but that's as short as I can make it for this.
That's a great story. And you know, with Reverend Walter and Gloria, when I was young, back in Boston, I heard about Dr. Mildred Jefferson. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but Mildred was an African-American physician in Boston and very active in pro-life work. And Gloria, can you tell us a little bit, sort of follow up on her, about how you got involved in the pro-life movement and how you see that intersect with racial justice?
Yeah, let's see. How did I get involved in the pro-life movement? You know, I think I was always pro-life. I'm from the South, you know, from South Carolina. And just, if you get pregnant, you have a baby. I mean, it was like, you know, maybe grandma raised the baby, but you know, that was just it. That happens. And so it just never was in my worldview, you know, to have a abortion as something that you would do because you're pregnant. However, I started to, when I was in high school, met some girls who were, you know, saying, oh, our friend is pregnant, she's going to get an abortion, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, why would she do that? Why didn't she just have the baby? And that's when I was first introduced to people who were like, why should she have the baby? It's going to ruin her life. And I was like, well, what about adoption? And just having, I guess I was just so stunned that there were people that would immediately seek abortion as a solution to, you know, a one-night stand, even if you're in high school, you know, having this, I was just like, it was just unfathomable to me. And I don't think I think they thought I was really more naive than anything, but it was just a position that I was like, it's the child, give birth. Somebody else will raise the child, somebody in the family and give the baby up for adoption. This is not a life destroyer. And it's normal. We're female, we get pregnant, you know, so it's kind of peculiar. I would say I became really actively pro-life after a moment I had in church. It was like a mystical experience. We were saying the creed during mass, and I said, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life. And at that moment, I just heard like a voice, are you lying? Are you blaspheming? How can you say this when you're not doing anything to defend the gift of life? How can you expect to ask for the gift of life when you die, when you're doing nothing to defend the gift that has been given? And it was like all happened in like a split second that I had this sort of mini chastisement. And it sort of held up the mirror, if you will, that I'm saying, you know, I believe these things, you know, I believe that all the stuff that I'm saying during mass, well, it has consequences and implications. And for that moment forward, it made me really hunger for what the church taught about the dignity of the human person and why. And then just from learning about that and being willing to, I don't know, serve, I guess. I received invitations to participate in this thing on some pro-life matter or be on a board for maternity home and a pregnancy center. And I said yes to all of it. And, you know, I deeply imbibed and believed the truth in Genesis 1:26, that we are made in God's image and likeness. And that's for every person from the moment of conception until natural death, right? And if we're made in the image and likeness of God, we have an inherent dignity that no one can denounce. And it's a rebellion, really, to ignore that. And we have rebelled against God's word in that way, whether it's abortion or racism. And it was surprising, I guess, to me that people knew I was very much pro-life, I believe in the dignity of the human person, but yet were stunned and appalled that that actually also applied outside the womb. So that I had an opinion about the brutalization of our brother, George Floyd. And that I was like, this is a grave injustice. And people were like, wait a minute, that's outside the talking points for you, Black woman, pro-lifer, stop. And I was like, well, wait a minute now. We have to realize why are you shocked? I believe in the dignity of the human person. Just like, you know, we say we do. I believe what God said in scripture when he said we were made in our image and likeness. And I believe that no matter what a person does, we cannot undo what God did when he made us. And it is more contingent on those of us who believe to act according to those beliefs, whether the person's likable, whether the person is, quote, criminal or has done criminal acts, they're still made in the image and likeness of God. Now, they may behave beneath that dignity, but that does not mean that we then behave as if they have no dignity. So to make that connection for people, because that was one big thing I started to see was missing from my brothers and sisters who were pro-life. They were employing the same arguments that the pro-abortion side uses to dehumanize the child in the womb. They were employing those same arguments to dehumanize George Floyd. And that's when I realized that we had an anemic understanding of human dignity. And we needed to really expound on and talk about the issue of racial justice, of how it is not a competitor against defending the life of the child in the womb. We can walk and chew gum. You know what I mean? We can both stand. And also how it is inconsistent for us to point to the child in the womb and say they're worthy of dignity and respect, and then point to other human beings and say they are less than human, they're not worthy of dignity and respect. You know, all the buzzwords that people are using, you know, he did this crime, he did this, he was high on that, as if all of these things robs a person of the dignity that God had given them. It doesn't. And also, I thought it was important to talk about racism because we needed to see how racism, in effect, also disfigured Officer Chauvin. We also usually only look at racism as the person who is impacted by it, but the person doing racist acts, holding racist beliefs, are deformed as well. They are behaving beneath their dignity, sometimes to such a degree that they do these heinous acts, like what we saw with George Floyd, or in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, with those 3 men who chased him down and murdered him. We need to have this discussion And we need to have people realize the consistency and actually ask them, do you believe what God said? And if you do, then how are you acting like it? How are you manifesting that? And do you see how racism is a grave rebellion, how it is directly against God's word and against his plan for the human family? And so to me, I don't see how people don't see the connection. And one last thing I'll say, racism also is the root of many other ills against things that we claim to value in our country. Just for example, take the example of slavery. Through slavery, and I'm going to speak specifically about Black women. Through slavery, Black women were raped and brutalized. They were not allowed to marry. All the things that we talked about, the sacredness of sex, the sacredness of marriage, racism enabled a violation of all those other things that God had for the human family. Think about the slave owners that committed adultery, that raped, that were the first men to abandon their Black children to the auction block. We talk about fatherlessness. If they don't understand how racism enabled all of these evils for centuries, and that we are still dealing with the effects of it, then I think we've missed, the meaning of sin, the meaning of human dignity, and the meaning of, or our obligation rather, to try to repair and reconcile what has been broken through sin.
Thank you very much, Gloria. I appreciate it. Reverend Walter, you look like a man on the move in the car there. Can you?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your work in the pro-life movement, how you became involved with it, and your perception of the connection with racial justice? Walter, did you hear me?
Not always pro-life. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? All right. Yeah. In high school, I wasn't. In college, I wasn't. I'm working on my master's, and I get married. We have our firstborn son. Our son's born a little less than 6 months, and he's in the preemie ward. He's down to 1.9, and he eventually gets down to 1.6. Now, while he's in the preemie ward, I'm surrounded by parents, and they're in the same situation. And day by day, their baby's dying. Their baby's dying. While I'm there, I'm witnessing, I'm sharing, we're hugging, we're holding one another, we're loving one another. And the doctors and nurses, see me doing that, sort of leading church right there in the preemie ward, in the hospital. Well, eventually, the doctors have a meeting, and we all knew that meeting was bad news. And so eventually, my time came. It came when my son was probably the only one left alive in the preemie ward. And the doctor was telling me that there was nothing more they can do, and my son had some problems that they couldn't solve them. And we argued. He told me the problems. I solved one of the problems by my father and I became my son's blood bank, because at the time they could not guarantee that the blood supply was not HIV/AIDS tainted. So my son's alive and well now, but back then, it was touch and go. And so eventually the doctor I parted company, he didn't appreciate the fact that I was a Christian, because I thought I told him I knew a greater position than you. And I wasn't going to accept my son's death just by listening to you. And so I go home, pray all night. Maybe you've had a problem like that where you prayed all night long, just waiting for God to speak to you. Well, I did. It was like that. It's my firstborn son. But I never heard a word from God. So now I'm back in the hospital in the preemie ward. It's 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I'm there early, and I'm holding my son in the palm of my right hand. And as I'm holding him, he's moving, he's squirming. I can feel him move and squirming in my hand. I begin to notice my son in ways I've never noticed him before. Before, I would only see the needles, the hospital apparatuses, the tube. I see the machine and all of that. But this time, I'm not just looking at him. I'm actually beholding him, and I'm seeing his eyes, his fingers, and his toes. And my son looked just like me. I said, oh my goodness. And then that's when God answered my prayer. God literally spoke to me. And when he speaks to me, he literally calls me by my name. He says, Walter. I say, yes, Lord. And he said that what you're holding in the palm of your right hand is what's supposed to be inside the womb of a woman. And when God told me that, I clearly understood what abortion was and what abortion does. There was no question about it. And my life has never been the same since. Slowly but surely, I became more and more involved in the pro-life movement, to the point where today we focus on reaching Black pastors and helping them put together a program that will allow them to implement pro-life programs in their church.
And Walter, what do you see the link between being pro-life and ending racism in this country and in this world, if we can?
Oh my goodness. Just a few years ago, the Black employees of Planned Parenthood's headquarters in New York published a statement agreeing with the pro-life movement for like the first time ever. We were all shocked that Margaret Sanger was as racist as the day is long, and we're talking about a very long day, all right? There was no question that Margaret Sanger is racist, and how she used racist tendencies, she used racism to promote her agenda. Now that went a long way. We were able to finally communicate the truth. What Gloria said is absolutely correct. There's always been this link between racism and abortion. And oh my goodness, it has just gone through the roof. It's not getting any better. And so I would definitely agree that there is a definite link. If you were to remove the racism from the abortion issue, I mean, the numbers of Blacks having abortion would be dramatically different. And I can even go back. Let me just, one more quote. Back in the 60s and mid-60s, I think it's 1966, 1965 maybe, Cecil Moore was president of the Philadelphia chapter of the NAACP. That was one of the most powerful NAACP chapters in the country during the civil rights movement, no question about it. Now, Cecil Moore says this, and I'm quoting him, that Planned Parenthood's plan is replete with everything the Negro needs to commit race suicide. There was no question that abortion was all about racism. It was just another tactic to get rid of Black America. And oh my goodness, when I look at the data today, and let's just say it doesn't look too good.
Thank you very much. Herb, when you're doing your work in a variety of different fields, and you bring up this consistent ethic of life and that you're anti-abortion, or that you're pro-life, let's put it that way. Do you find that folks who are anti-racist are open to that, or they get upset with you? How's that go?
So I think it depends. I think that there's no, in the way that the pro-life movement is incredibly diverse. We have people who are staunch conservatives, and we have people who are liberals, and we have people who are atheists, and everything. Every movement has that. Like, I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of saying that everyone who's pro-life is a Republican, and that means that they support Donald Trump, and that they support war and the death penalty, and that they oppose, they oppose anti-racism, or that means that they're racist. I think in the same way, the culture wants to say that anyone who works to end police brutality and racism in the medical field and in the courts and in everywhere that it is, that means that they are pro-abortion, because that is the left, and that's what that is in this country. But we know from this panel, and I know from interacting with people in both sides, whether they're pro-life or pro-choice or anywhere else, that there's a lot of nuance. Like real people don't fall into this this paradigm of, you know, everyone agrees with these talking points. In reality, it's much more nuanced. And so I would say it totally depends on the person you're talking to. You know, generally speaking, I think when I go into the pro-life movement, it's often more a semantic debate than anything else. You know, the phrase Black Lives Matter might be offensive to a conservative person because they have all these hangups about, you know, the 501c3 Black Lives Matter. But almost no one in the wider conservative movement or in the pro-life movement would not agree that Black Lives Matter. They might be a little cagey about that phrasing, but you can still work with people despite disagreements, especially about these language disagreements that I think hold too much weight in our culture, like which hashtag you use, All Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter, when the question really is, what are the steps that need to be taken to decrease police brutality? What actual, you know, sort of policy changes, like abolishing no-knock raids, for example, or limiting qualified immunity, if not getting rid of it? And the same with the pro-life side, where when I talk to a pro-choice person, whether or not I say pro-life and that gives alarm bells that I am like a Christian fascist that is anti-LGBT and is anti all of these things that I don't agree with. You can actually talk to them about what they think about abortion, because despite the pro-abortion movement, very few people are pro-abortion, even if they concede that legal abortion is a necessary evil. They think of it as an evil, and we can work with people like that to decrease the amount of abortions through policies that can, you know, make life easier for someone who gets pregnant unintended. And so I would say that it depends who you're talking to. I don't ever want to just say, you know, I go up to someone and I know that they support Black Lives Matter, and that means that they believe all of these things, because people do that to me with the pro-life thing. And, you know, on the other side, with all the other issues, you know, someone might think that because I identify as LGBT, that means that I am a liberal and that I support abortion. And that's not true. And so I think that I never want to put people into boxes before I talk to the individual human being and see what they actually believe.
Thank you, Herb. Gloria, you're known and have witnessed as a strong woman, strong Catholic, obviously an African-American woman. Do you find your anti-racism viewpoints welcome in the pro-life community?
No, no. And I only say that, I say that from the experiences that I have had. I've gotten so much hate mail from self-identified pro-life, devout Catholics about racism, some claiming it doesn't exist, some say it exists only because I talk about it, some, you know, use derogatory terms about Black people and, you know, just all kinds of awful stereotypes. And, you know, I've had people say, you know, you were so winsome when all you talked about was women, you know, and defending the right of the child in the womb, but something wrong and bad has happened to you since George Floyd, you know, those kinds of things. It's just, and I think all of this really happens, Father, because the conversation around abortion has become really more one that's about political party allegiance than about looking through things with the lens of the faith. Now I'm talking about the Catholics that I've dealt with. I see them more about political party allegiance and never doing anything that might seem to not go with what the party is doing. And I'm like, our allegiance should be to Jesus Christ. You know, forget, you know, that is our overall allegiance. I don't care if what I'm saying might not be something that the Democrats might like or that the Republicans might like. All I'm caring about is it something that the Lord is going to be pleased with? And I'm speaking strictly in the milieu of believers and Catholics, right? And so because we have allowed, and I think this is a terrible mistake, we have allowed the discussion to be merely about temporal power, political power. People see it through that lens. And so when I speak from the position of what the church already teaches, from what God himself has said about us as human beings, it's received as that I'm some kind of crazy leftist, what's the newest thing now, Marxist, whatever you want to say, to not engage with the substance of what I'm saying. And so, no, it has not been welcome at all. I mean, I lost a lot of friends, people that, I worked with and marched with for years, just now sort of like, are afraid that whatever I have might rub off on them or might rub off on their reputation. And, I think it's foolish. I think the only thing that we need to be concerned about is it true? Is it beautiful and is it good? And is it according to God's plan? And again, being so wed to having temporal power, which I think is a seduction of the enemy, so wed to having temporal power that they would frankly jettison the other things that are beautiful, true, and good that we're supposed to follow as believers. And also, I have to say this too, Father, it's a bit of the feeling, what I see sometimes is a defensiveness, particularly among white Catholics, that somehow maybe they're going to be perceived as racist. And I'm like, this is not about you. This is not about you. It is about what's doing what is right. And together, looking at how the human family the bonds of the human family have been broken by this sin, and what can we do to repair it? What can we do spiritually? What can we do also concretely in the world to repair the bonds of the human family? And so, no, I haven't felt welcome, absolutely not. In fact, people would follow me around on social media and troll me. People would go to sites where I would speak and just say all kinds of nasty, untrue things just to try to, I guess they felt like they didn't want me to be talking places and people needed to know I was a Marxist, whatever. I'm like, I'm a Catholic. That's it, plain and simple. But yeah, no, definitely not at all. Not at all. Totally jettisoned by a community that I felt was my home. Yeah, completely. No.
That makes me really sad. I don't know if it makes you feel better to say, blessed are they when they insult you and persecute you for my sake.
Yes, I'm a third order Carmelite, so that completely sits with me and has been a source of, I don't know, just like a balm for any wounds that I've experienced. And I will say this too, people who are anti-racist have fully embraced me. And even when they may not have agreed about abortion, I think they still listen. And I mean, there are people on the pro-life side who will listen and stuff like that, but it's not the same in terms of the vitriol I face. Like, I don't face this kind of vitriol from people who are anti-racist about my positions on defending life in the womb that I have faced from people who defend life in the womb have about what I talk about, the evil of racism. It's just not the same.
So you find like if you're talking to the narrow crowd or something like that, they're not going to be as nasty as some of these so-called great Catholics.
True. And I think part of that too now, let me just say this, part of that too, I think is also because within that narrow crowd, they have been, at least a part of it, they're trying to be sensitive about the issue of race and trying to hear me as a Black woman and not necessarily be, so they're trying to have a certain kind of, well, let's listen because she's a Black woman, even if we don't agree with her. That's not quite the same on the other side, unfortunately. But I think we'll get there, and I'm not going to stop unless the Lord wants me to, and he makes that clear. So,
Walter, within your church circles, and when you talk about anti-racist stuff, well, I mean, you work in the Black church, so that's a stupid question for Myles to ask. But the question I was going to ask is, what do you see this intersection, with the pro-life movement and anti-racism? Do you find pro-life folks are accepting of it or not? Or have you run into the same sort of bad stuff that Gloria has? Can you hear me, Walter? Oh, well.
Looks like it froze.
Walter's a little bit frozen right now. Oh, there he is. Walter, can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. What I wanted to say is that what Gloria said applies to me as well, but we work directly with the pastors in the church. And for the most part, they're Democrats. Now, what's happening is that the brothers are struggling. They realize that being pro-life is as biblical as the day is long. They realize that the Bible is clear about when life starts. They realize that they can just go right to Genesis 1 and they can see that God himself is the creator of life. I mean, we go even further. We can go to Exodus chapter 1, and in Exodus chapter 1, we can see a late-term abortion. We've got Pharaoh on one side, we got the midwives on another side, and oh my goodness, it's clear whose side God is on. And so it's not that they don't know where God stands. It's not that they don't understand or they're misunderstanding that. They know. So after a while, whether they're Democrat or whether they're Republican becomes almost meaningless because now they got to talk to Jesus. Now they got to face God. Now they got to open up their Bible. Now they got to preach or teach in front of their congregation. And how do they answer the question, is God pro-life? Does the Bible support abortion? Is the Bible pro-choice? On and on. Now with that, our ministry has grown to the point where there are brothers looking for places where they can go quietly, have that intimate conversation where they can discuss what's going on in their heart. And that's so much of what we do now. So I really want to, I could definitely agree with what Gloria had to say. Yes, it's an issue that we face, but because the Bible is the church's platform, whereas the Democratic Party platform reads like Romans chapter 1. It's clear where God stands. It's clear where he is on this issue. It's clear whose side he's on. And when it becomes that clear, oh my goodness, when it's that clear, it becomes even more difficult to portray the God that you serve, the God that you pledged your life to. And oh my goodness, understanding that has really helped us move deeper and deeper in terms of our mission. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you, Walter. I appreciate it. Herb, this, it looks like it might happen that Roe, Casey, that framework could dissolve with the current Supreme Court term, and I guess we'll hear about it in June. Cardinal Sean O'Malley was talking at the pro-life mass at the Basilica saying, if and when this happens, we really have our work cut out for us. And now, I mean, you're not operating out of a faith perspective, but what do you think the challenges are if we get what we wish for?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple. I think that the obvious one is that when Roe falls, that will not be the end of legal abortion in the United States. It will be the end of legal abortion in many states, which is a positive. But we will still have to go state by state, organizing stronger than we are now, because right now it's a national fight, and it sort of, if the pro-life legal strategy works and we get the right ruling in Dobbs, really what that entailed was voting for a pro-life person every couple of years and hoping that eventually enough judges get on the Supreme Court to do this. I am not so confident in that legal strategy, but I am hopeful that it's going to work out. But we have been disappointed by the Supreme Court before. But so if Roe falls, and I'm hoping it's a win, and that win is going to happen this summer, we will have many states where abortion is still legal. And in fact, we have states like California coming out and saying, we want to be an abortion sanctuary where we're not only using taxpayer dollars to fund abortion, but we are using taxpayer dollars to get women from other states into California in order to fund their abortions. And so as pro-lifers, we know that that is obviously not the answer. But we cannot let the answer be to say, well, I live in a red state. I had a trigger law. Abortion is now illegal here. And so I don't need to care about it anymore. I'm pretty terrified that that is a strong possibility of what could happen, because like for me, it wasn't real until I realized it was happening in my community to people my age, to people around me, that I really became activated on the issue. And so I fear that we're going to have this the syndrome where we see that we won, which we did, but we take it as a total victory and not really the stepping off point to actually creating an abortion-free country and then eventually world. Because we know that that's just the legal side of it, that, you know, overturning Roe is not a total legal victory. But even if it was, you know, even if the Supreme Court was brave enough to say not only is Roe overturned, but actually abortion itself is unconstitutional, and we are now making it so that elective abortion is banned in all 50 states. I think that would rock. Basically, no legal scholars think that that's possible, but it'd be cool if that happened. But even if it did, even if best case scenario, Roe falls and abortion becomes illegal throughout the United States, even then, we are not done. We still have to meet the needs of the people who otherwise would be abortion patients. We can't just say that, okay, well, now abortion is illegal, and so the work is done. I want to be clear, that is still a goal. It is still incredibly important to make sure that our laws reflect the reality that every human life has worth. There should not be full classes of human beings that have their legal rights denied to them. So I am totally on the side of making abortion illegal. But when we do that, we need to realize that there are so many needs that are unmet. And that's why most people who get abortions say that they're getting abortions. You know, it's the pro-choice lobby, things like Guttmacher, things like Sonia Sotomayor brought it up in the Dobbs decision, that we need abortion because, 70-something%, a huge number of women who get abortions say that they need them for economic reasons. We know in the context of this discussion, we know that things like poverty, things like workplace discrimination, those are also, of course, disproportionately affecting Black women for a whole host of reasons, both historical and modern discrimination. And so we have this reality that we can't just say, okay, we won, and so we can pack it up, we can close all the pregnancy centers, we no longer have to worry about the life issue anymore. It's really just getting started. And I think is sort of the most exciting time to really, put our money where our mouth is. We've made this claim as a pro-life movement that we are standing with mothers as much as we're standing for their children. And so when Roe goes, which I'm very hopeful is going to be this summer, that is, I think, a really exciting opportunity to prove everyone wrong that said we don't care about children after they're born, or we don't care about the people who are pregnant with them. And we get to really walk with pregnant people and young families and people in all different types of circumstances that need assistance, and we can do that as a movement, and I'm confident we can, but we really just need to steady ourselves and prepare for that reality, because it is hopefully coming soon.
Thank you, Gloria. Again, a similar question, that if Roe is overturned, what does the pro-life movement need to do, and perhaps in particular for poor Black women who are in a tough situation sometimes with a pregnancy? What do you think needs to? How does the pro-life community need to step up for all women?
Well, I would say the Catholic Church is the #1 non-governmental provider of services for pregnant women in crisis, right? So we just need to keep doing and expand what we are doing. We are going to have a state-by-state fight on the matter. And so in the places like California, which probably Pastor Hoye could talk about, we need to ramp up what we're doing in California. And let me add this, from the friends that I have in California who are pro-life, who are working with communities of immigrants and low-income women of color, these women don't want abortions. They actually want to keep their children, but what they're often offered is abortion as a solution. And let me just say this, killing the poor is not a solution for poverty. Okay, let's just say it right now. That does not solve, killing the poor is not a solution for poverty. But often that is put forward as, you know what, you can get out of poverty if you just don't have that kid. And it's a lie, because you're never really addressing the root causes of what has caused this person or these communities to be in an area where their schools are underfunded, where there's police profiling, where there's a food desert, you know, not even a grocery store like that serves real food in the premise. Is just a way to look at how certain communities had become forced communities with where people of color were forced to go and live by government practices and laws and regulations, redlining, the refusal to give Black GIs access to, you know, VA loans, GI loans, things like that. So we're unwilling, I think, to really look at those systemic issues that are causing a lot of the poverty, right? And I think we have to be ready to look at those things. We have to realize oftentimes when we are talking to women about choosing life, they are going to end up staying in poverty. It is going to be a life that's harder, but we need to walk with them. We need to be with them. We need to, out of friendship, solidarity, and love, walk with these women and accompany them and do all that we can to offer friendship and material support. You heard I said friendship and material support. It's not a, hey, stay warm and well fed. This is a real engagement on our parts. One thing I like, Destiny Herndon de la Rosa, founder of New Wave Feminists, said, I was on a panel with her recently, and she said, pro-life is a verb, not a vote. And she's right. So we have to expand and continue the things that we're already doing. Those who just think it's simply just voting, we need to help them understand it's a verb, and we need to get involved, and we need to be ready to have policies in place at the state level that fund these organizations and institutions that are providing women and families in crisis the kind of support that they do need. Our work's not done. It's just the beginning of being able to create this culture of life and start this revolution of love that's really required, you know, on our parts. This is what is necessary.
Thank you, Walter. What from your perspective, what do you think is going to be the challenge for the pro-life movement if we begin to see the end of Roe versus Wade?
It's probably going to, in my opinion, the challenge for the pro-life movement, particularly reaching into my community, is going to be the same. They're going to have to realize and understand that everybody's different. And you're going to have to understand the real reason why people reject the pro-life movement. And if you don't know why someone is telling you no, you don't know why someone is rejecting your proposal, you don't understand why someone can read the same Bible as you, read the exact same chapter and verse as you, and still not agree with you, even though it's in black and white, or in some cases even red and white. If you don't understand why, you're going to run into some very difficult challenges coming up with strategies and proposals and ideas on how to move the discussion from point A to point B. So these challenges are going to still be there. And what we've done at Issue Life Foundation, our challenges has been to implement and to understand those reasons. And in my line of work, there's 4 specific reasons why the brothers say no to the pro-life movement. And when you understand those 4 specific reasons why, at that point, you can put together the best strategy. So I would wholeheartedly agree with everyone with what's been said. Even though we win in the Supreme Court in June, I'm hoping, that'd be great. But that's not the end of the matter. There's still a whole lot of work to do. And there's still going to be a whole lot left for those of us that are in the pro-life movement now, working right now, already involved in the pro-life movement. It's going to be a whole lot left to do. So I want to encourage everyone to stay where you are and to work even harder, because victory in the Supreme Court is not going to be an end to the struggle we're facing. And in California, my work's just not going to get done. We're going to be here for a while.
Father Bob,
Gloria,
I just
please.
wanted to add one thing that I didn't say earlier. We also really need to look at our institutions and our culture vis-a-vis women. Right now, some businesses make accommodations for pregnant women. And frankly, I worked in corporate America, and there's a hostility toward women when they get pregnant, have to take maternity leave and all that kind of stuff. We need to change that whole mindset rather than seeing it as, oh gosh, we got to accommodate this. It should be seen as a good business practice for all the female employees, that we understand that women, by our nature, we get pregnant. That's just the way the human race goes on. And we should have a culture that's built in business and the military and education that supports that. How many schools actually have something for students to get pregnant and students that aren't married to get pregnant so that they continue their education? What do we have in businesses that really help women still be a part of the economy when they're pregnant and mothering? You know, it's really difficult and hostile actually for women to try to make it, especially if you're poor. I mean, some of the policies that required a woman when the child is 6 weeks old to put the child in daycare and go out and work and find a job, you know, this welfare to work stuff completely undermines the things that we think are important for bonding with the baby. So we need to really look how our policies that are in place mirror what our values are around the human person, around the family, around the child, the mother, all of that, and the father too, because we don't get pregnant by ourselves. We really need to do a wholesale revisiting of what our policies and attitudes are and practices as well in our organizations and businesses and military that will support the very things that we want: choosing life, supporting life, human flourishing.
Follow up on that, you know, with folks in the pro-life community, what would you say to those brothers and sisters about listening to the voices about anti-racism, about paying attention to what happened with George Floyd, with Ahmaud Arbery, with, you know, the list goes on. And how is this going to really change their heart, change their soul? You know, I don't see how you can be pro-life and racist. It seems like saying, you know.
So, yeah, I agree, Father. I think that's the rub, isn't it? A lot of actually people that have these racist tendencies don't think they are. But if you start to help them do an interior inspection, right? As Catholics, we should be real good at these examinations of conscience, right? To have an examination of conscience, because people think, oh, I've never said a racial slur. I don't say any racial slurs, therefore I'm not racist. But when I do things and give like real life examples for people to ponder, for example, President Biden's recent announcement that he's going to nominate somebody for the Supreme Court that has integrity, that has qualifications, all these things, and this person will be a Black woman. The outcry immediately was this, and she's not even been named. We don't even have a name of a person, right? Could not possibly be qualified. And what happens is you started to see by the president saying this, it really challenged people who have competing ideas about Blackness, particularly Black females, and competence. It didn't match. So much so that people were so bothered by it. He should just have never mentioned race. You know, he should have never mentioned that part, because doing so really created kind of cognitive dissonance, if you will. And I don't blame them. I mean, what do we expect in a country with centuries of racist social conditioning? What do we expect in a country that even upon emancipating other human beings, it was a more than centuries long resistance to their freedom? What do we expect when we have marketing that portrays Black women as, you know, Aunt Jemima maid serving, all they're good for is serving? So to tell people now that a Black woman and judicial power and competence can reside with this Black woman, you are really messing with a lot of the centuries long conditioning around who is competent and who should be able to wield judicial power. So you have to help people understand how the conditioning that we've had in this country can affect them. You know, so their idea of racist is some extreme thing, when really it's not just the extreme. And or how people can even look at George Floyd being brutalized and not say, oh my gosh, that's awful. They'll say, oh, what did he do? Oh. And I got that from religious and lay people alike. And so they didn't even see
I
the
just don't know
odiousness
how a
of
human
it.
being could be on a knee on a neck for 9 minutes.
Father, you and I both can say that, but I will tell you from the many conversations I have had with well-meaning people, they didn't, all they could see, and think about it, we have been conditioned to see the Black person as criminal, as just the opposite of everything virtuous, right? As promiscuous, as lazy, as untrustworthy, as
Dangerous.
animalistic, as animalistic. And if you have that belief and been conditioned to have that belief around that population, it is how you can see that extreme brutalization and say, well, this is what you do with animals. These animalistic, they need, they're out of control. Or to quote Hillary Clinton, what did she call them? Super predators, that kind of stuff, right? So when you have that conditioning in the mindset of so many, why are we surprised that they can watch a video of a man be brutally murdered and instead of feeling compassion and empathy, just assume he must have done something wrong to merit that brutalization. And that's the effect of racism. It's not the extremes, which we all can point out. It's also that kind of conditioning that when you can see someone brutalized, you don't see brutalization of a human being. You see, well, this is how we have to deal with these animalistic criminals. So,
Walter, I mean, what would you say to your colleagues in the pro-life movement who aren't African American about the importance of anti-racism for the movement? Were you able to hear me, Walter?
I'm sorry, I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you before. What's up?
Sure. The question I was asking is, when you speak to folks in the pro-life movement, white folk, what would you tell them about the importance of anti-racism for their witness to pro-life ideals?
Well, one, I would like to share that we're going to have to be honest about it. Racism is not new. It exists. It's real. It's there. I think that it needs to go both ways, though. We need to understand, even from my perspective, from my community, from my side, that racism is there. But racism doesn't hold us back. I can remember, my mama goes back to 1929, and my grandmama goes back to the early 1900s. So now I'm sitting in my grandmama's lap. I'm the only boy in the family, and my grandmama is talking about racism, talking about, how white folk treat Black folk, all right? But you know what she told me the answer was? Said it didn't matter. They didn't even think racism would ever end. It was never going to end. It was a waste of time to talk about it or look at it from that perspective. They said that if I held on to Jesus Christ's hand, if I lived my life according to the word of God, the same Jesus that rose us up out of slavery would rise me up in America today. They kept emphasizing how it was so important to focus on living my life according to the word of God than it was for me to focus on how racist white folks were or how uninterested in racism Black folks were. I mean, we could go on and talk about it. And so, today it's real. It's there. There's no question about it. But if I was going to move forward, I had to realize that if I live my life according to the word of God, if I live my life according to Christ, the same Jesus Christ that rose us up off the plantation would be able to rise us up off of where we are today. And that's something that when I'm talking to the pastor, we talk about that quite a bit, because that's a message that many of the brothers want to get home.
Thank you, Walter. Herb, a question for you. These are coming from some of the folks who are emailing stuff in. Do you have any tips for pro-life students in our college campus, to get involved with anti-racist activities? Maybe they're a little scared, maybe they're a little encouragement, some suggestions?
Yeah, I would say attend talks like this, host talks like this. I really appreciate that it was Georgetown Right to Life that was the one that convened this panel. I think it's exciting when I see pro-life groups go out of their way to say, no, we're going to actively talk about this. I think that what you see, at least was the case certainly when I was a pro-life college student, is that you have these assumptions made about you and made about your political beliefs based on the fact that you identify maybe, first as pro-life, like the Georgetown Right to Life would. And I think by doing things like this and having these kind of dialogues with students, you do these things for two reasons. One, because it's correct. It is morally right to be anti-racist. It is a moral necessity to be anti-racist and to care about, all of the systemic and individual forms of oppression that people of color face, and all of the different forms of systemic oppression that exist in the world. You should just care about those things in a genuine way. But in a totally cynical way, it just helps you. If you really are someone who exclusively cares about the unborn, like you have the, Josh Brahm puts it as fetal tunnel vision, you only care about the violence of abortion. It's, I encourage you to not think that way. But even if you do, you should still be anti-racist and you should still talk about it with people, because as Walter said earlier, if you eliminated racism, you would eliminate the reason that a lot of abortions happen in the United States. We know, I think it was Sherilyn Holloway, I'm wearing her bracelet right now. She's the founder of Pro-Black, Pro-Life, which is a great organization. She's a good speaker. Invite her too on the next panel. But she sort of made the observation, and we've been talking around this, Gloria has brought up this idea, that pro-lifers sort of will see, won't acknowledge racism in anything other than in abortion. They call out the racist eugenic legacy of Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood, and the pro-abortion movement, and liberals, but won't really see racism in anything else. They kind of turn a blind eye to it. But pro-abortion people, liberals, will be able to look at the entire world, look at things like the criminal justice system and healthcare and housing, and basically every institution that has unfortunately been tainted with racism, and will recognize that and work to dismantle racism within those institutions. But then when you bring up that the legacy of abortion also has this racist legacy, as does almost every other institution, why wouldn't it, in this country that was founded on extreme dehumanization and abuse of Black people, Indigenous people, and immigrants throughout history? Of course racism would be a part of the legacy of the pro-abortion movement. And so I think being able to bridge that gap and say, you're both right. Both the pro-lifers who see the racism of Planned Parenthood and of these economic policies that value paying taxpayer funds to fund abortion over taxpayer funds to assist someone facing a difficult pregnancy. All of these things are legacies of racism, and I appreciate that you see that. And then being able to go to the pro-choice side and saying, I agree with you, as someone who identifies as anti-racist, who has said hashtag Black Lives Matter, if you want to put weight in the different semantic hashtags that you might use, being able to go to them and demonstrate sameness and say, no, I'm on your side. I'm not just talking about racism when it's convenient to my pet issue. I think it's so valuable. I think that we have this stereotype of, the racist, conservative, Trump supporting pro-life person. And I've seen in my experience, if I show up at a Black Lives Matter protest, or when I was in my student group, if I was hosting speakers to talk about these important issues outside of just abortion, you're able to demonstrate to them that you're not that caricature, which means that the sort of programming that you get as, I used to be a default pro-choice person, that you don't even need to listen to them. They have all these bad opinions, just completely disregard. If you realize that some of their opinions might be good, like being anti-racist and supporting Black Lives Matter and, whatever else, you get to break down that barrier and actually reach people for the first time who have never thought about abortion. And so the first time they're really engaging with this issue beyond the my body, my choice platitudes, you get to be there and walk them through what the abortion debate really is, which we know is a question of the human rights of the unborn child, and not simply when does life begin. We know when life begins, and the question needs to be which human lives are protected. And so being able to be there for that person can be the opportunity to create the next pro-life activist. So again, like, be anti-racist, actually care about it. But if you want to be the person who just cares about abortion, you should still be anti-racist. It helps you, and it will help the women and help the children who otherwise would have, gone through with abortions because of, these systemic barriers and systemic oppressions that are linked to historical racism.
Thank you, Herb. That was great. And I want to thank all our panelists. Gloria, you just live down the street from me. I'd love to take you out for a cup of coffee now that we're getting out of COVID.
Okay. It's a date.
Right.
It's a date.
Okay. And I'm going to turn it over to Mateo Caulfield to bring it on home.
Yes, thank you so much, Father Sheehan, and thank you to Gloria, Walter, and Herb for coming to speak to us today on behalf of Georgetown University Right to Life. We thank you so much for coming to speak to us, but also thank you so much for the work that you guys do to make a world where abortion can be unthinkable, where racism can be unthinkable. There's still so much to do, and there's a lot to celebrate this year. But again, we are so thankful for